Great. We're going to go ahead and move on to new business 8B, COLA and long-term projections. This is an informational item presented by Ms. Janie Shaw, Mr. Paul Wood from GRS and Company. Again, just make sure your speakers are on and you both have the floor when you're ready to present.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I have to move this closer. I'm always accused of being a soft talker, so we'll bring this close. It's wonderful to be here. We're going to cover a couple of items today. We're going to sort of set things up for the COLA calculation, and then Janie's going to walk us through some sensitivity projections. So it's always important to understand where we are today, but it's really important to understand where we're headed down the road. And so we're going to try and address some of that and get you start thinking about, what does this plan look like not only today, but also 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. So if we go to slide 3, we're going to start with the calculation of the COLA. And the COLA is defined in statute, and there's a pretty strict formula that's involved in calculating the COLA. And so initially, what we do is we do a calculation where we look at the rate of return on the actuarial value of assets. And this is a key component here. This is a key thing that we all need to understand. This is the actuarial value of assets, which is the smooth value of assets. So it looks at the returns over the last 4 years. So it's not just the return in one single year. It's essentially the average of a return over a 4-year period. Then we subtract from that what we call the hurdle rate, which we're going to talk about here in a moment. And then the calculation of that is multiplied by the funded ratio of the preceding valuation from June 30. So you can see the formula here. Actuaries love formulas, and there it is right there. Return on AVA minus hurdle rate times funded ratio equals the initial COLA. On the next slide, there are some limitations that are applied to that initial COLA calculation. So first of all, the COLA cannot be less than 0.5%. So in any given year, at least 0.5% COLA will be paid. But then there also is some limitations on the high end. So if the plan is less than 100% funded, then that it's limited to 3% if that's what the formula dictates. And if you're greater than 100%, then that maximum COLA could be all the way up to 5%. There is a group of grandfather retirees who will receive a 2.5% COLA. And so those are the folks that attained at least age 75 prior to July 1, 2020. And then those who retired with 25 years of service whose annual pension is less than $25,000 a year. On the next slide, we have a few different definitions of the hurdle rate. And we'll start with the statutory definition, which, as you can imagine, may not be as straightforward as one would think, but it says the investment rate of return required to fund a cost of living adjustment in excess of 0.5% as determined by the association's actuaries. So that's us. So what does that mean technically? It basically means that, what is the investment rate of return assumption that would be used to result in amortizing our unfunded liability over the board's funding period of 25 years. And embedded in that is the assumption that the COLAs in each future year would be 0.5% paid every single year. Now that's again very technical, so we've tried to put it into more of a common sense definition. And so, what do we need to return on our assets in order to pay the benefits plus that 0.5% annual cost of living adjustment? And that hurdle rate, it's a calculation that's going to be done each and every year. And in a couple slides here, we're going to show you the difference between the hurdle rate that was calculated the prior year and then the one that's calculated this year, and just talk for a moment about what impacted that particular calculation. So on the next slide, we have the July 1, 2026 COLA calculation, and we compare that to the COLA calculation from the prior year. So the return on the AVA was 4.98% in 2025. Now you might be thinking, well, Paul, we had a really great year. We had almost an 11% return. Why is it at 4.48%? Well, we're still recognizing some adverse investment experience from 2022 where there was a negative 4.3% return. And so that's playing into this particular calculation. And so 4.98, and then we take the hurdle rate, which was 7.17%. That results in a negative number. So it's effectively 0. And we would multiply that by the funded ratio, which also results in 0. And this is where that limitation comes into play. So you have the 0.5% limitation. So the expectation is the July 1, 2026 COLA will be 0.5%. And just to compare that to the prior year, The prior year's calculation resulted in a cost of living adjustment that was above the 0.5% minimum adjustment. And that's because the actuarial value of asset return was 8.13%. And you can see that in the prior year, the hurdle rate was a little bit higher. And so, the experience that happens over the year is going to impact that particular hurdle rate. So, to the extent that our retirees or our active members retire or terminate, or our retirees pass away, experience like that, or what our salary increases look like, that's all going to play into that hurdle rate calculation, which again is done each and every year. So maybe I'll just pause briefly to see if there's any questions on the July 1, 2026 calculation before we go into a couple more details to set the stage.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Are there any questions, comments at this period? All right, seeing none. I just have one comment. I do like the way you're explaining that the return on ABA is inclusive of a time period and not just we're at 11% this year. Why isn't it that high? And I think that's something that's important for any retiree to understand, because I've been posed with many questions on how is this even calculated. So I think this presentation is maybe I missed it in the previous ones, but it's really standing out to me. So I appreciate you looking back historical to the negative in 2022 return, showing that it's an accumulation of period of time on what the actual COLA is going to be. So I think that's an excellent description. I hope any retirees who are here in the audience or who are listening are really taking in this information. So thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right, you proceed.
All right, great. And we can really drive home that point on slide 7 here. Slide 7 shows that history of those returns. So going back to 2022, there's that negative 4.3. And then we did a little better, 5.6, still a little bit below the assumption of 7.25. But the last 2 years, 24 and 25, were really nice years. So 8.2 and then 10.3 in 25. And so the negative 4.3 is going to be dropping off for the July 1, 2027 calculation. So that's going to give us a little bit of a tailwind here on the COLA and could help us move towards a COLA that's greater than 0.5%. So what we did is we did some sensitivity on the fiscal 26 return, which we don't know yet. We've got 2 more months to go. And I think everyone's aware there's a lot of uncertainty that's out there. So who knows what the next 2 months will hold. But if that fiscal year 26 return was 3.5%, then that would result in an actuarial value of asset return of 6.8%, which would then lead to the 2027 COLA based on the July 1, 2026 valuation of 0.5%. And even if we had a 7.25% return in fiscal 26, the AVA return would be 7.7%, and we would still end up with that 0.5% cost of living adjustment. But you can see that if we get above that, if we hit 11%, then the actuarial value of asset return will be closer to 8.7%, and then that will lead to a COLA potentially of over 1%, I think, which would be a really great outcome. So, we just have to hold tight the next couple months, and the investment team is, from what I've heard, is doing a fantastic job in putting yourselves in a good position. And so hopefully, we get there at July 1, that we see those nice results, and we can see that ability to potentially pay a COLA that's in excess of 1%.
I just want to pause here real quick and just for clarifying, just because we do have a bit of a typo on this slide, I just want to clarify for the upcoming July 1st, 2026 COLA. So that's the COLA that's going to be paid in the next few months. That is set at the 0.5%. That is set at the 0.5%. So what we're talking about on this slide, which will depend on our upcoming return, that's what's going to be paid in about a year. So that's the COLA that we're talking about right now. So I just want to clarify that.
Thank you. Yeah, in the heading, it says July 1, 2027 COLA, but I think within the text, okay, within the body, got it. All right. Thank you for that clarification.
Now, on slide 8, one of the questions that we get asked is, what is going to affect this COLA as we go through time? And one of the items that's jumped out at us is your funded ratio is going to be extremely important to helping to pay those higher COLAs. And so we've gone through this exercise of showing you what those potential COLAs could look like at various funded ratio levels. And again, one of the outcomes is the better you're funded, the higher the likelihood of a higher COLA being paid is. And you can see that the biggest piece that's changing is in that middle, the hurdle rate. And we expect the hurdle rate to come down over time as we improve our funding. So at an 80% funded ratio, we expect that hurdle rate to be around 6.5%. And so if we compare that to our valuation assumption of 7.25, we could see a 0.6% COLA. But if we were 90% funded, then that hurdle rate would go down even further, and that could result in a 1.13% cost of living adjustment. And then being fully funded could put us at a 1.75% cost of living adjustment. So again, the board, I think, has spent a lot of time thinking about ways to improve the funding. And one of the outcomes of improved funding will be the ability to pay a higher cost of living adjustment. Then we did some sensitivity on that actuarial value of asset return. Uh, we have it set at 7.25, which is our assumption. But if it was higher than that, you can see that it would result in higher COLAs being paid. And if you're 100% funded and you have that 8.25% actuarial value of asset return, you could see a COLA of 2.75. But then on the flip side, if we do miss the mark and we're a percent lower than the assumption on that actuarial value, you could see a cost of living adjustment of 0.75. So again, the key message here is, as we improve our funding, that likelihood of paying these higher COLAs is going to improve. And so, when I look at this plan, that seems like the biggest need is let's improve the funding, and then everything else will fall into place after that. So that's all we have for the COLA. So happy to take any questions.
All right, thank you, Mr. Wood and Ms. Shaw. Is there any questions or comments related to the COLA calculations? All right, seeing none, we can continue.
Next, we'll move on to the next part of the presentation. So this part of the presentation, we're going to start with a review of the June 30, 2025 valuation results. And then we're going to move on to a projection of those results, kind of what happens if everything goes according to plan. Now, the board has seen both of those items in October when we came with those results originally. So those are going to be a review of what we've previously shown you. But what's new this time is what we're actually going to show a sensitivity. So what happens if everything doesn't go exactly as we're predicting? And the purpose of these is not to make a recommendation to the board, but the purpose of the sensitivity is to show the board kind of what is the volatility of our potential results in the future. And essentially what this is going to give you is kind of the risk profile of PERA and what is our potential volatility in the future. And that's the purpose of these projections. So if we start here on slide 10, so this is just going to be a brief overview of the June 30, 2025 valuation results. Again, these are our most recent valuation results. We'll have updated valuation results for you back in coming up in October. So this is just going to be an overview of some key terms that we're going to be talking about as we go through the presentation. So the first is our unfunded liability. That was $9.7 billion as of June 30, 2025. Your unfunded liability is essentially your liability minus your assets. So think of your liability as essentially the present value of the benefits you've promised your members to date. We compare that against the assets that we have, and that's your unfunded liability. If you want to look at that a little differently, we often refer to it as your funded ratio. That's just your assets divided by your liability. So essentially the percentage of your liability that's funded. That was 65.2% as of June 30, 2025. Next, we're going to look at your statutory contributions. So these are the contributions that your employers and your members are required to pay by law, by statute. These are what they're actually paying. So again, you have many coverage plans across PERA that they're all paying different member contributions. They're all paying different employer contributions. But for ease, what we do is we actually average those across all of your coverage plans. And so we have a member contribution of 13.97% of pay. And for your employers, that's on average 17.29% of pay. So that's the cash that's coming into PERA right now. That does fully, that has all of the phase-ins of the Senate Bill 72 increases. So if we compare those contributions coming in against that unfunded liability that we have, we expect that unfunded liability to be paid off in about 50 years. So I'm going to skip the actually determined contribution by right now, and we're going to actually talk about that on the next slide. So if we move on to slide 11, it's important to keep in mind that we often talk about PERA in totality. We talk about it in just the aggregate PERA numbers, but it does have a lot of coverage plans, and we do often refer to it by the 5 divisions within PERA. So that's the State General Division, the State Police Division, the Municipal General Division, Municipal Police, and Municipal Fire. So if you compare how that unfunded liability is actually between all of those different divisions, you can see the state general division does encompass the majority of that unfunded liability at about 5.3 billion. So you can see that's the vast majority of our unfunded liability. Your state police division is actually overfunded. So what that means is that that division actually has more assets than liability right now. And then the rest of that unfunded liability is between your municipal plans. If we move on to the next slide, we'll do the same thing, but we'll look at your contributions between division as well. So I'm actually going to look at this chart here. If you start on the bar on the right, so those are those statutory contributions that I was talking about. These are the contributions that your employers and your members are statutorily, legally, what they're currently putting into the fund. If we look at the bar on the left, that's what we refer to as our actuarially determined contribution. So this is kind of think of that as your gold standard contribution, right? If we were to put those contributions into the fund, we would get that unfunded liability paid off in 25 years versus the 50 years that I spoke to earlier. So the difference between those two bars that we show right there, that's what we often refer to as our contribution shortfall. So as of fiscal year 2026, that contribution shortfall was 4.65% of pay. But again, that's average across all of PERA. If you compare that within the different divisions, you can see it does vary. So state general, we have about 9.96% of pay. Municipal general actually is only about 0.2% of pay. That means they're paying just about their actually determined contribution. And then municipal police and fire, it's small as a dollar amount, but pretty high as a percentage of pay. That's because those divisions are smaller than the others. If we look at that in terms of dollar amounts, in terms of annual appropriations that would be made to make up that shortfall, that 4.65% of pay turns into about $225 million a year in appropriations to make up that shortfall. So that kind of is where we're at today. Those are the results where we're at today. Next, we're going to look at what those results look like going forward. And if we actually move to slide 14, in order to project those results going forward, we need to make a number of actuarial assumptions. So the first actuarial assumption that we're going to make is we're going to assume that all of your assets earn 7.25%. That's your investment return assumption. And we're going to assume that all of your COLAs are paid equal to our actuarial assumptions, which start at 1.25% a year. And then finally, we're going to assume that your active members who retire or leave employment, they're replaced by tier 2 members. So essentially, we're assuming your active population remains level. And then we're going to assume that there's no change in your statutory contribution rates. So the contribution rates that are being paid today, those are going to continue to be paid into the future. But we are assuming that payroll increases by 3%. And what I mean by that is your total payroll, the payroll that your contributions are paid on, are going to increase by 3%. What essentially that means is that the contributions, the cash that's coming into the fund is also going to increase by 3%. So what we're first going to look at is we're going to look at what happens to your valuation results if all of these things actually happen. What happens if everything goes exactly according to plan? What happens to PERA, and what do those valuation results look like going forward? So if we move on to slide, I think I've lost count, 15. First of all, what does our funded ratio look like? So I'm going to actually just focus on the blue line here. That's based on our last year's valuations. The blue line, you can see that funded ratio starts at 65%. That's the funded ratio as of June 30, 2025. And you can see it stays pretty steady for a while until we finally start turning a corner in about 15, 20 years or so. And it starts to finally go up, finally reaching about 100% funded in about 41 years. And that's in 2066. So the question is, why is that 41 years less than our 50 years? And that's because this projection takes into account changing demographics of your plan. So as your tier 2 members start coming into PERA, their benefits are less expensive than your tier 1 members. So as those tier 2 members start replacing your tier 1 members, the cost of those benefits are less. So that means there's going to be more money in those contributions to pay down that unfunded liability. So that amortization period is going to improve over time, ultimately getting down to about 41 years based on this projection. You can see if you look at where we were projecting about a year ago from the last valuation, it did improve some. If the board remembers, we saw some pretty high salary increases for your active members. We also saw your employers hiring people. We saw more active members coming in. More payroll means more contributions coming in. That did improve the funding of our plan when we saw those more contributions coming in. But the question is, what does that 41-year amortization period really look like? On actuarial standards, that's a pretty long amortization period, even if it is less than the 50. So what does that look like in terms of your unfunded liability? Well, if we look at our next slide here, what that looks like is it looks like your unfunded liability continuing to go up. So again, we have these blue bars here that represents the unfunded liability of PERA in total. So it's going to start at that 9.7 billion as of June 30, 2025, and it's going to go up for at least the next 20 years is what we're expecting, getting right up to about $12 billion until we finally start to turn the corner. So why does it finally start to turn the corner? Well, so if we talk about what we're looking at here, why that unfunded liability really starts to go up, think about your unfunded liability as any kind of debt. So if you think about it as a credit card balance or you think about it as a mortgage, essentially what's happening is we're not even paying the interest on that. The contributions that are coming in are not paying the interest on that. So that principal balance is going to continue to go up. But we do eventually start to turn the corner after about 20 years. The reason for that is we are projecting those contributions to go up. So again, payroll goes up, we're paying contributions as a percentage of pay. As those contributions finally start to increase a little bit, we do finally turn the corner on that unfunded liability where it finally starts to go down. But again, I want to remind the board that this chart means everything went right. Everything goes exactly according to plan. So if everything doesn't go according to the plan, this chart can look significantly different than what I'm showing right here. And that's actually what we're going to start talking about in the next few slides. So I'm going to actually pause right there and see if there's any questions or comments from the board before I keep moving forward.
Is there any questions or comments from the board? I do have a question. Ms. Shaw, if we can go back to slide 12.
Yeah.
On the ADC, the chart on the left, is that bar showing employee and employer?
Yes.
Okay. What I would like to see is it separated from employee and employer.
Okay.
And the reason why is because I'm fixated on this ADC topic because there are some states that require the employer or the state to fund it at what the actuarials are determining is needed. And I'm not looking to take more money from the employer, from the employees, right? And so I'd like to see that parsed out if possible, because that's something that I know Member Colin Schnitch and I have been discussing. We spoke with Paul Wood about it at a retreat, and it's something that I really want to just get more information on. So I'd like to see that parsed out, employee versus employer.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. We'll get that parsed out and we'll get that to Greg to get to you.
Excellent. I appreciate that. Thank you. No other comments at this time.
Madam Chair.
Sorry, Member Perea, then Member Salazar Henry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I didn't mean to interrupt you. Thank you for all this great information, GRS team. I really appreciate it. I just had a couple of questions. So on slide 10, I know that to the left it said 9.7 billion, but on the right it says 9.7 million. Is that just a typo or is there something I'm missing on that?
It's 9,717 million. So those numbers, it's not a typo here
Okay.
because of the comma there. So I mean, it kind of looks like it could be, but it's not
Only
9.717. It's 9,717.
Okay, so what's the difference between the 9,717 million to the 9.7 billion?
It's just expressing it in a different way. They're equal to each other. So if we divided the 9,707 by 1,000, that would give us the billions. So
Okay.
they're the same number.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And then just a second question. State police members, is it the state police members who pay more in contributions, or is it the employer that pays more in their contributions? Therefore, why they're overfunded?
Madam Chair, do you want me to take that, Paul?
Sorry, so it's actually the employer that pays, the employer that pays more in those contributions. So the state police member contribution is about 9% of pay, and then the employer contribution is about 25% of pay.
Thank you for that. So, Director Trujillo, and maybe you can help answer this. Have we ever looked or run some sort of scenario where the employer contributions go up, and does that help with the unfunded liability?
Madam Chair and Member Perea, we have, and we put that in front of the Investment and Pensions Oversight Committee as well as LFC pretty much every year, just showing what either an infusion of cash does or increasing the contributions do. I think for state general, we would need about 145 million recurring to get us within that 25-year period. If our employer contribution, right now the state pays 19.24%. If they increase that to 25, I think it's 25.1 is what they pay for the public safety plan. Yeah, we would look a lot better.
Thank you.
Thank you, Member Perea. Member Salazar Henry.
Madam Chair and Mr. Wood, how many retirees and Tier 1 employees are still in the system? And what's your projection to when the Tier 1 employees start leaving and start collecting retirement?
So I don't know that we have the exact numbers in front of us, but I do believe
Percentage?
it's the active population is more than half tier 2 at this point. So our projections do assume that the tier 1 members are leaving. I don't have the exact numbers in front of me, but again, our evaluation does take that into account. So our evaluation does have tier 2 members in it.
Okay. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, if I may, just for Member Salazar Henry, we do look at that internally. I believe the breakdown as of last fiscal year was about 67% are tier 2, 33% are tier 1. And that ratio should decrease for tier 1 each year as people start retiring or continue retiring.
Yeah, and so it's been about 12 years since the tier 2 was implemented, and we would expect 10 to 12 years, about 10 years, the population turns over, or about half and half, and then it'll start to increase. It tends to slow down a little bit because you do have like these stragglers that the tier 1 folks. There would be some people that work for a very long time, but you're kind of right on schedule with where we see with other plans that have implemented a second tier and how that population turns over.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Are there any sort of assumptions made for this new AI boom that's coming for all different sectors you're trying to fit in somewhere? I mean, there's going to be some impact. I don't know if it's going to be washout impact or anything, but there will be. And I just wonder if there's any assumption in there about what happens if the number of tier 2 employees decrease, but maybe salaries increase.
So what would happen in that situation was that your active population would start to decrease, which means your payroll would start to decrease. We actually have a slide on that to kind of show you how that would impact that. So if you don't mind, if I kind of pause you for 2 slides before we get to that.
Perfect.
Excellent. All right. I see no other questions. We'll go ahead and continue.
So next, we're kind of going to go through some scenarios to see what happens if something does change. So again, these are not meant to be recommendations to the board. Our current assumption set is still our best estimate for the future of PERA. But what we're going to go through now is what happens if something changes based on these estimates. So there's 2 methods that are currently funding PERA. So we have cash contributions that are funding PERA, and we also have our investment returns that are funding PERA. So we're going to look at both of those. We're going to look at both of those and see what happens if those things change. So if we actually go back a slide to slide 17. we're going to start with the actual cash contributions that come into the system. So we talked about kind of funding that actuarially determined contribution and that's kind of the gold standard of contributions coming into the system. But it's important to note that really any additional funding into PERA is important, and it's also going to help the financial stability of PERA. So say we only get about half of that additional funding. So we talked about that shortfall was about 4.65% of pay. So what if we only get about half of that shortfall coming back into PERA? So for simplicity, let's call that 2% of pay increase in your employer contributions. So that doesn't necessarily mean that every employer pays an additional 2% of pay. We're just going to call that an average 2% of pay increase in our employer contributions for PERA. Alternatively, that would be about essentially an additional 100, maybe 120 million in appropriations coming into PERA. So you can see if we look at this chart here, so that blue is that unfunded liability projection that we looked at on the previous slide with that 41 years. But you can see that green line, you can see that's a vast improvement in the projection in our unfunded liability. It's not quite the 25 years, which is our goal, but it's still a big improvement. So that pays off our unfunded liability not only 10 years sooner, but you can see that unfunded liability doesn't shoot up as much as we were expecting under the blue line. So you can see that it does increase a little bit. We're still getting that negative amortization. We're still seeing that unfunded liability increase some for the next 7 to 10 years or so, but it's not going up as much as the prior projection. So you can see how even some additional funding into PERA does greatly improve the financial outlook. So kind of the goal here is to kind of say, this unfunded liability is going to have to be funded at some point. So it's either going to have to be funded today or it's going to have to be funded tomorrow. And so that's kind of the purpose of this. Another important part of the slide is I want to emphasize, the increases that we saw in the employer and the member contributions from Senate Bill 72 that we just finished phasing into. This also emphasizes how important those increases were. Because if this projection, if we didn't have those increases in those member contributions, if we didn't have that, those blue lines there, that would never take a turn. That blue line would just keep going up. That unfunded liability would just keep going up. So that really emphasizes how important those contribution increases were. I know no one likes to see contribution increases, especially when they impact the members, but they were really important for this financial stability. Alternatively, if we look on slide 18 here, so this goes to the question before. If we look at, again, we collect our contributions as a percentage of pay. And right now we're assuming that total payroll, that those contributions go up by that 3%. That's why we're able to turn the corner on that unfunded liability. But what if we miss the mark on that 3% of pay? What if our employers stop hiring more members? What if that active membership starts going down, whether or not it's from AI or any other, or maybe it's just an economic downturn? What if instead we miss that mark, even if it's just a 2.5% increase in our payroll? So rather than those contributions going up by 3%, they're only going up by 2.5%. You can see even that small sensitivity greatly changes this chart again. So you can see, again, we have those blue lines there. It's a little bit harder to see on this chart. Hopefully it's not making anyone dizzy. But again, those blue lines there, that's that unfunded liability that we saw before on that first chart. But the red line there, that's if we miss the mark on that payroll growth. So if contributions only go up by 2.5%, you can see that unfunded liability continues to grow and doesn't turn the corner really for the next 30 years or so. So that's, again, a significant change. So you can see if we miss the mark on any of these assumptions, these projections can change a lot. And that's really the point of these, to kind of show the board that we show these projections, but they can change if something in the future changes. So that's the cash coming into the system, but what happens if the actual investment returns differ from what we're expecting? So if we move on to slide 19, in order to look at volatility in our investment performance, now we know there's going to be volatility in our investment performance. The markets are inherently volatile. We know we're not going to earn 7.25% each year. We know they're going to be volatile. So in order to look at our investment volatility, we don't just look at one scenario like we looked at before. Instead, what we're going to do is we actually look at 5,000 different scenarios. Don't worry, I'm not going to show you all 5,000 scenarios. But what we do is we actually look at all 5,000 different scenarios at different investment scenarios. And we look at those and then we compare them and kind of give you a probability ranges. So 25%, 50%, and 75% to kind of give the board a range of probable scenarios of the future volatility of our results. And then keep in mind that, as Paul said in his presentation, your investment volatility also affects your COLA. So we're also going to look at how that investment volatility affects future COLAs paid to your retirees. So if we move on to slide 20 here, so again, we're looking at this funded ratio graphic again. So that black line there tracks pretty well with the line that I showed you earlier. But if you look at your green line there and your red line there, so the green line there shows you essentially if we saw positive investment results, and the red line there is a pessimistic investment results. So if you kind of consider the area between the green line and the red line, we kind of consider that a probable possibility of future results for PERA. So you can see if you look at the very near term, you can see it's very narrow and it gets further out as we go through, throughout the years. So that meaning that there's more volatility as we get out, 20, 30 years. It's a little bit harder to predict where we're going to be at. So that being said, there's a very big range of where these results can be. The reason for that is because we are paying just the set contribution rates. If we, Madam Chair mentioned retirement systems that pay actually determined contributions, so those contributions actually vary based on results. This would be a lot more narrow because in our situation, if your contributions aren't varying, but your funded ratio is varying, we're going to see more variability in these results. If on the alternate side, your contributions vary, then these results are going to be a lot more narrow. So that's where we're seeing the volatility in your funded ratio based on your investment returns. So on the flip side here, you can see that green, there's about a 37% chance that PERA is fully funded after 30 years. But on the negative side, if we do miss the mark on our investments, you can see that funded ratio is just going to keep going down. And then finally on slide 21, how does this affect our COLA? So the COLA, again, varies based on our investment returns. So kind of in the middle of the line here in our black line, you can see it increases. It starts to increase from about 1% leveling off to about a 1.25% COLA about in the middle of the line. So I want to make a note about this chart. When we show this chart, this is actually the 5-year average COLA. So again, like I mentioned, we are going to have investment volatility. So there's going to be years where we miss the mark on our investments. That's just the nature of the markets. When that happens, the 0.5% COLA is going to be paid. So actually, when we do these projections, about 50% of the time, that 0.5% COLA is going to be paid. What we're hoping for is on the upside, that's when the higher COLAs are paid. So that's why we show kind of this 5-year average COLA that's being paid to your retirees. It's a better show of what your retirees are actually going to get paid over time. So again, we kind of see on the flip side, if we miss the mark on our investments pretty consistently, that's your red line. Not unsurprisingly, we're going to have that minimum 0.5% COLA being paid. If we do really well on our investments, that's when we start getting into the 2% range of our COLA. But again, we'd really have to do well on our investments to start getting consistently into that range. With that being said, that's all I have in the presentation. If there's any more questions from the board.
Thank you, Ms. Shaw. Is there any questions from the board? Then, all right. I do have a question. I know you speak about Senate Bill 72 and its funding and what it was expected or projected to do. And here we are almost to that 10-year point. Would that be accurate?
I believe it's 6 years. I believe it was in 2020.
2020. Okay. Is it, in your opinion, that Senate bill is doing what maybe the actuarials determined it was going to do? Has it accomplished being at this level where we are today?
So I don't have those exact projections in front of me to see what exactly they projected it to do, but I do think it was a first step, I would say. I think there's still more to do. I think it was a good first step getting more contributions into the system. I do think it was a trade-off between the different groups. I think it was probably a hard trade-off for a lot of groups, but I do think it was a good first step. That doesn't mean there's not more to do, in my opinion.
Understood. And I guess I'm just trying to gauge. I was gonna, yeah, Director Trujillo.
If I may, on slide 20, we had these same kind of projections during, the discussions of Senate Bill 72. And that red line right now, it says there's a 4% chance that we could be potentially depleted if things go bad. When we looked at these prior to the passage of Senate Bill 72, we were at 33% was a chance that we could be depleted. So that was kind of the big thing, is not going off the cliff, and there's still a possibility, but 4% is a lot better than 33%.
Okay, perfect. So this is where I can gauge and say Senate Bill 72 is working, but maybe needs modification.
It is, Madam Chair, it is working, and not as quickly as we would like it. Some of our assumptions have changed since that passage. Mainly our mortality, our mortality has improved. We now take that into account. If we still had the same mortality assumptions that were in effect when Senate Bill 72 passed, this would look better, but it's realistic to recognize that that mortality, and that's something that we look at every 3 to 5 years when we do the experience study.
All right, thank you. Yeah.
I'll just say how I look at it is it got us out of an immediate situation. It got us out of a depleting our assets situation. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily on the perfect actuarial track, but it did get us out of the immediate situation that we were in.
Yeah, excellent. All right. And I don't think I've ever reviewed that report, that actuarial report. So if I get a copy of it, Greg, because I would like to know today if we're sitting when it was presented to the legislature, when it was presented and passed, what was their expectations and where exactly are we today? Is it doing what's intended? It sounds like it is, but I'd like to review that report. All right. Any other questions? Member Kolesnich?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thanks very much for the great objective analysis. That's what I love. I mean, give me the facts. I wanted to respond to the question from our new member here. With respect to the impact of AI, there's been a lot of talk about this in the popular press and in the financial press. The answer is, and this is the answer I've been giving, which is common sense, is that yes, at a minimum, it's going to impact job growth. What happened was the financial services and the tech industry, when they saw considerable community resistance coming into these AI data centers and all the subsidies associated with those, they sort of changed the dialogue and initiated a carefully choreographed and paid for charm offensive to make people improve upon have a more favorable image on that. If you want to understand why, you might want to think about the $77 million tax break to create one permanent job at a JP Morgan data center. That would explain why the financial services industry has sold this as a great thing for our members. But there's no way it can't diminish the amount of money coming into the PERA trust fund going forward. And don't take my word for it. Look it up on ChatGPT. Their own systems say that it's going to impact jobs. They also confirm the existence of this charm offensive, which was initiated a little while ago. So it is going to have an effect. And this is one of the things that we need to take into consideration when we think about the future of PERA and its unfunded liability. So once again, thanks very much. And if you want, I can show you I was just a securities lawyer for 20 years. What do I know? I just studied economics undergraduate. What do I know? But if you want the AI version of that, I'm happy to share that with the rest of the board members. I have nothing further, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member Kolesnich. We had Member PERA with her hand up, and then we'll go to Member Salazar Henry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This has been so fascinating and just super interesting. And I think we all know that COLA is always every year the number one topic among our retirees come legislative session. And I know firsthand how hard PERA worked around Senate Bill 72, as well as board members especially going around the state to provide town halls to kind of educate people about Senate Bill 72 and hearing that, it has made an impact, maybe not as fast as we would have liked. But I think it's super important that we communicate and also just be transparent on that. And also just share this education with our retirees. Because I think even with active members, we're not, very well versed in the lingo and what a COLA is and what it entails. And I'm just wondering how we can provide some sort of outreach to our retirees. I mean, right now there's only about 15 participants on today's meeting. And I think, legislative session, you see hundreds of people packed into rooms during that time. And I'm just wondering what sort of outreach we could do as board members to educate our members on all of these updates around COLA. So that was just kind of my thought. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Member Perea. Member Salazar Henry.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Woods, or actually, this is for Director Trujillo. You mentioned that 145 million recurring would need to come in. Is that per year for a set number of years?
Madam Chair, Member Salazar Henry, if we got that kind of an appropriation, and actually I think that's just for state general, that's not for all the other divisions. If we got that amount coming in for the next 25 years, that puts us on the right path to get to 100% for state general.
So my second question, Director Trujillo, is what would the cost be for a 2% COLA if it was paid by the legislature and is not part of the obligation here? If you switch the obligation that the legislature appropriates that money every year just to deal with the COLA issue, what would that cost be to the current retirees going?
Madam Chair and Member Salazar Henry, I may have Janie join in after this, but the bill we had this past legislative session to pay a 2% 13th check for all retirees was about 35 million a year.
No, but I'm talking a COLA, not a.
Correct. So,
Yeah.
so our average retiree is currently 69 years old. We anticipate a male living till 85, a female 87. We can't take that 2% back. So the compounding effect over that is significant. And Janie has done calculations of this in the past. I think she can probably weigh in a little bit more articulate than I.
Sorry, I'm looking for the numbers for you. So are you, is the question just a one-time 2% COLA? Just
No. If we removed the COLA obligation from the funded liability here and had the legislature appropriate the COLA, so
Okay.
retirees would quit coming to the board here and would work with the legislature. I mean, I know that's a pie in the sky thing, but I'm just wondering, what would it cost?
Madam Chair and Member Salazar Henry, well, Janie looks at that. I think I recall if we just restored the 2%, went back to the old model, it adds about $2 billion to our unfunded liability. So the legislature would have to fund that $2 billion to us to take the liability off us and
Yeah.
put it on them.
It's about it's about $1.5 billion in total liability. So that's about 8.8% of pay each year.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great, thank you. Sorry, are there any other questions or comments for GRS? No, seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Wood. Thank you, Ms. Shaw. We appreciate your presentation as always. All right, we're going to go ahead and move on to 8C, Board Travel Training Presentation, Informational Item